whether or not as consumers we can recycle a garment, how long that garment lasts, if it's repairable, really those are design decisions. And so the producer needs to have some responsibility for what they're putting out into the world as it becomes waste.
Welcome to Climate Check, Stories and Solutions for Fighting Climate Change. We are part of 350 Brooklyn, an organization that strives to counter the climate crisis through local action. We work toward a world that is just, equitable, and sustainable, and where all beings can thrive. I'm Audrey Stanton, she, her, and I'll be filling in for Eva Dean as your host today. I'm a Brooklyn-based writer with a background in sustainable fashion and co-lead of Climate Check. Today's episode is especially exciting for me because we're discussing textile waste and the fashion industry. Our guest is Jessica Schreiber, the CEO and co-founder of FABSCRAP, a nonprofit dedicated to commercial textile recycling right here in Brooklyn. Hi, Jessica. Welcome.
Hi.
I'm looking forward to talking with you today about fashion textile waste. Would you mind introducing yourself with your pronouns?
My name's Jessica Schreiber, she, her.
Before we get into the topic, can you tell us a bit about your personal climate story?
Sure. It actually starts in undergrad. I was studying biology. I really thought I was going to be a doctor. And in those courses, started to learn a lot about ecology and our environment. There was one class that was just on like current topics in science, and climate change got one class in that course. But in that class, I remember the professor was this was obviously years ago too, shocking me that we were using 5 planets worth of resources and how limited our action was. And so that is where I made the switch into really wanting to focus on climate change, sustainability, but also through the lens of education and how do we communicate this? How do we make this part of like public knowledge? And so that is the route I took.
So after you decided to get more vested in working against the climate crisis, what made you want to work with textile waste?
Yeah, I think there's so many ways to get involved in climate. And so I finished undergrad when I added a second degree in education and then really wanted to focus in grad school. So I went to Columbia and they were just starting their climate program. The program is called Climate and Society. And now Columbia has a whole climate school that this is a part of. But at the time, it was just part of their like graduate school of arts and sciences. And that was really focused on the hard climate science, but also the sociology of climate change and how people accept or don't accept or make choices about it. And like I said, there's so many different facets of climate change. A lot of my peers were looking at CO2 capture or water issues or solar power. And I was the only one who was like, can we talk about trash? Can we talk about waste? And so I had an adjunct professor who was working at New York City's Department of Sanitation. And I really peppered her with questions about her work and applied to be an intern for her at the Department of Sanitation because for some reason waste and recycling seemed like something that needed a lot more attention to me. We're just using resources like they're infinite and they're not. And so that's how I landed at sanitation right when they were launching their clothing recycling program. So I started to see New York City's clothing waste, and brands were also wondering what they should be doing with their textile waste, not clothing, but like fabric scraps from the design process. And that's when the light bulb went off that the same way we have a thrift infrastructure for used clothing, companies need a thrift infrastructure for the raw materials that they use.
So you were in a unique position to then start a company that had an actual understanding of the problem and possible solutions.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if you work within the industry, you can solve this necessarily. Like, I think one of the most beneficial things is that I wasn't in the fashion industry. And so I was coming from it from the logistics side of waste management and understanding what recycling meant and collection meant and reuse versus when you're in the fashion industry, your job is design and fashion and aesthetics. And so, like, I know so many people who are so concerned about climate change and their industry's impact on the climate, but I think it is a lens with which they do their work, not necessarily the solutions piece.
If you were to give a little mission statement for FABSCRAP for our listeners, what would you say is the ultimate mission?
The ultimate mission is to eliminate commercial textile waste. very ambitious.
Why not?
Requires a lot of pieces, but further in our mission statement, we're doing that as a transparent recycling service for brands, as an affordable and sustainable materials resource for individuals who are making things with fabric, and being a source of education for a community of change makers. Because for me and my co-founder, we feel like, well, we saw a problem and just chose to get involved and make a change. And if we could do it, really anyone can do it. So I think so many people can be empowered by the fact that you can notice a problem and take action on it, and it can have a really big impact.
So you take those donations and then you say you have a thrift store sort of component, but it's rolls of fabrics, it's scraps of fabrics, right? Not actual pieces of clothing.
Exactly. I think that's where there's always some confusion, because we're a nonprofit and people hear nonprofit in fabric and they think like used clothing. And I did so much work with used clothing when I was at sanitation. That is a very full marketplace. There are so many people, particularly now as vintage becomes more popular and there's online versions of resale and retail. So we're not in used clothing at all. We're in, it's almost unused material from the design process. So we have leather skins, we have cones of yarn, we have buttons and zippers, yards of fabric, some 2 or 3 yard cuttings of fabric. Sometimes we will get sample garments, but usually you would think of used clothing like ready to wear. Sometimes they're scribbled all over with designer notes, or there's still safety pins in them, or there's giant holes cut in them. And so we do have sample garments, which we call mendables, and they're available for sale if people feel like they're ready to upcycle some pieces that are sort of done. But you won't really find used goods at our thrift store. It's all the raw materials to make things.
Got it. And all of that is coming from different designers, people in the garment industry, warehouses. What are the different businesses that you're working with?
Yeah, so we work with 800 fashion companies now, which is, it's still shocking to me, because that means we are 8 years in. It's been a pretty steady, like about 100 brands every year, 100 new brands every year sign up for service, which, side note, I think is great. It means that people within those brands are starting to recognize that sustainability is important to customers, but also important to their business longevity. And so more and more businesses are signing up for service. And it's a lot of fashion companies, from couture to mass market. So probably things you and I are wearing today. We work with those companies. We work with Oscar de la Renta and Marc Jacobs. We work with J. Crew. We work with Gap. Most brands are fine if we share their names. It's very rarely that a company is like, no, I'd prefer to stay anonymous, which is funny because it wasn't always the case. When I first started service, some brands, it was like 50-50. Some brands were like, no, like we'll recycle with you, but please don't put our name on your website. But over time, I think particularly as more and more Earth Days happen and brands want to speak to the work that they're doing on Instagram, in their CSR reports, now the default is brands are like, please make sure our logo is on your website so people know that we're recycling with you. So brands you and I probably wear every day, more couture brands. We do have a lot of interior design companies, which is cool. Not something I realized would be part of the market when I started, but lots of upholstery fabric comes in. And then a few entertainment companies, which is exciting. We work with a few Broadway shows because their costumes get replaced and sets get replaced and updated. And so we work with a few Broadway shows too, which is really cool.
Yeah, that's fantastic. There's so many different sources that we don't even think of that create so much waste.
I think one of the things that was surprising to me too is FABSCRAP has been around for 8 years, and we have saved 1.8 million pounds of fabric from landfill. And that is just with design offices. So that's just the design of a garment. That's not touching production waste, which is where the design is finalized and it goes to a factory and they're cutting out the shirt pattern. Then there's all those cookie cutter edges of the fabric that's unused. We're not even touching production waste in that 1.8 million pounds. That is just from the design process, the sampling of fabric and the mock-up of garments and the ordering of materials. And so I think that's the shocking piece, is that's just a drop in the bucket of what the whole industry looks like worldwide.
Absolutely. Do you know how New York compares to other fashion capitals and manufacturing hubs?
Most production is happening now in other countries, but there's a lot of design offices here. I don't know if this is, so much has changed like post-pandemic, but when I started in 2016, the estimation was that there were about 900 fashion companies who have their headquarters in New York City. A lot has changed, like I said, in the last few years. And I think that is probably one of the biggest fashion capitals. I think that's why New York has the name, but it is the headquarters, it's the business offices, it's the design offices. It is not where these brands are making clothing.
Right.
And this is not necessarily even where brands are selling their clothing in mass.
What would you say are the largest challenges that you're currently facing? That could cover a lot.
Yeah, I think right now, like what's most top of mind for me is that we just are starting to receive so much material, which is a really great thing because it means that brands are making the choice to divert it from landfill instead of just throw it away. They're more aware of their waste, they're accounting for it. The way that our system is set up too means that because we have a service fee for recycling, that brands are also internalizing the cost of this waste. But we're receiving so much material and we are bootstrapped to meet that growth. And so, for example, just last week, we got 1,500 rolls of fabric. And the team was like, okay, great, we can restock the reuse room and put some online. But I don't think anyone fully realized what 1,500 rolls looks like physically in an office or in a warehouse space. And so it's been days of work just to go through the rolls and figure out what we can put on the online store, what we can put in the reuse room. It is unrelenting, the waste. And so I think that's the biggest challenge in any waste management field is just it doesn't stop. There is no end. We're doing pickups every day from multiple brands every day. We're picking up 6,000 to 7,000 pounds a week, and it doesn't stop. Even during slow periods in the fashion cycles, fashion weeks, for example, things slow down. But then right after fashion week, they're cleaning out their studios and have a whole bunch of stuff to recycle. So I think just it never stops, which means we have to recruit more volunteers, move more fabric, find more space.
Yeah.
It's just a, unrelenting issue.
That touches on something I was also interested in is about maybe the biggest myths around textile waste.
This is one of my favorite things to talk about. I think one of the first places that I'll start is that there's a lot of marketing right now around recycled fabric. And I will say that you should review with a critical eye. I don't think we've really cracked fiber to fiber recycling yet, meaning a fabric back into a fabric. I think a lot of recycled fabric right now is taking plastics from plastic bottles. In some cases, it's like nylon back into a nylon, but not at a real volume or commercial scale. And so anything that's claiming recycled fabric, it could very well be recycled, but not necessarily from fabric. And so I think it's a little bit misleading because we do have so much fabric waste, and it would be really nice if we were creating new material from it. I also think most people don't fully understand that polyester is plastic. And that's one of the pieces too in the recycling piece and just in sustainability in general, that we're essentially wearing plastic, and that means that it's coming from crude oil. So the sustainability of pleather, for example, not so sustainable. I will say, I think some of the hard things as a consumer is what should I do with my clothing, because there's a lot of sort of confusion about what happens when you donate it or put it in that bin in the gas station parking lot. One of the things I learned at sanitation is the donation option, like giving it to an actual thrift store, always helps, because that means they can go through the material first, they're going to choose what they can resell, and it does benefit whatever their mission is. So for example, Goodwill is processing a lot of clothing, but their actual mission is to provide work for people with disabilities. And so by giving your clothing there first, it at least supports the mission first, even if it is going to get sold. Some of the bins in parking lots do tend to just be for profit from the beginning. So I think that's one piece where you could be a little bit discerning. But then I'll be honest, I've been in this field for over 10 years now, and it's really hard to know where clothing goes. It is not transparent. People do not want to share their markets. I know in New York, some of it will first go to other states before going overseas, but from those states, I think it's safe to assume most things are going to other countries overseas. And from there, I think we're exporting our waste to pollute other areas of the world. So it's hard. It's tough.
Yeah, yeah, it's a complex issue, and you guys are chipping away at a
One
specific
piece.
one piece,
One
but
piece,
a
yeah.
really important piece. How do you see FABSCRAP moving forward?
I think geographic expansion is something that we've always considered. If we do expand, we've always been interested in West Coast, probably LA, where there is not only a lot of fashion headquarters from the more corporate side, but there's a lot of fashion schools, there's a lot of creative things. Like we see people who use our fabrics in costume and set design. And so I think really doing some market research on the geographic piece. I would love to have FABSCRAP's data support some of the policy that's coming out. That's been really important to me is from the beginning we've kept pretty meticulous data because I think some of the ways we actually solve this problem is through supporting policy as it gets introduced. I've worked on local laws for New York City. I was recently at a city council hearing where I spoke and gave a testimony in support of some textile waste legislation. And so I think policy is another big place where we want to do more work.
I would love to hear about what you spoke to them about and how maybe you feel that could help in the future.
Yeah. So what I was in City Hall for was one of the city council members had requested that sanitation do a recycling feasibility study for textiles, meaning if we were to ban textiles, what is the feasibility to collect, to sort, to actually recycle, to keep from landfill? What does that actually look like? And I was there to speak in support of that because textile to textile recycling is not ready to receive a whole bunch of messy post-consumer material with a million different blends and all the hardware, buttons, zippers, all of that needs to be removed before you can recycle it. So who's sorting that? If it's not well organized from the offset of how you deal with all of that material and what the metrics are for how it becomes actual extended producer responsibility and not just an extra tax or extra burden on consumers, if that's not worked out ahead of time, it can be really messy. And so what I see policy moving towards in the textile space is an extended producer responsibility bill, which I think would be great because whether or not as consumers we can recycle a garment, how long that garment lasts, if it's repairable, really those are design decisions. And so the producer needs to have some responsibility for what they're putting out into the world as it becomes waste.
You also are recently off of a big climate week, and you had a fashion show, you had all sorts of things going on. What would you say you were most excited about that you accomplished or that you got to do?
We announced a merger with another company, Reclipped, and that's really exciting because they were doing sustainable fashion education and events for the community. So mending clubs and book clubs and panel discussions and workshops. And so they're going to bring all of that to FABSCRAP, and I'm really excited about that.
You spoke a bit about the things that have changed over the years since you started FABSCRAP, and I'm also interested to hear what maybe is the main thing that's changed and maybe the main things that have not changed.
I think the main thing that has changed is the brand's openness to conversations about climate change and sustainability, their willingness to support new initiatives, try new things, share resources. I've seen a lot of conversation shift towards, we tried this, here's what didn't work. We want to make sure all the other brands know, here's how it did or didn't work. And so even in some closed room conferences that I've been to, I just see brands really wanting to share what they're trying, what is working, what's not working. And I think it's interesting because I've seen a more willingness to share that with each other, but not so much publicly yet. And I think that's because some customers can be really critical. They're like, oh, 20% of this garment is recycled, and it's not like, well, why not 80%? But I think the more that we can applaud the steps, the more that we'll hear about what brands are trying to do, some of the obstacles that they're facing, and where there's wins. So I think that conversation is actually moving in a really good direction, much more collaborative, much more open to new initiatives. I think that's also indicated by how many brands have signed up over time. One thing that hasn't changed and that I thought would is that as brands use our service, we're set up in a pay-as-you-go model. The more that you send to us for recycling, the more it will cost. And that was intentional from a waste management perspective because it means that over time you should be incentivized to reduce your waste because then it reduces your costs. Not so much. What we've actually seen is brands are like, oh, well, I've been sending you my fabric samples and my cuttings and some yardage, but do you take leather? Oh, you also take zippers? Oh, you also take buttons? And so really what we see is over time brands sending more of their design waste, which is a good thing. And then it kind of plateaus. And the reduction, I don't know if we're seeing the call for reduction yet.
You started FABSCRAP in 2016, and you started it as a nonprofit. Could you
Right.
tell me a little bit about that?
We started first as a nonprofit. That decision was because I didn't feel like I personally needed to profit from the diversion of waste. Obviously, like I'm employed by the company, so I have a paycheck, but there is no ownership. And I think that was a really important decision. It implies some neutrality in that we can make sustainable recommendations to brands, and it's not based on anything except our mission to divert waste from landfill. It's not incentivized by like me and my ownership of the company or the board and their ownership. It really is, this is what we believe will lead to less waste for you in the industry. But, it was a tough decision to go nonprofit, I think, because when I was explaining the business model, there was so much investor interest. But when you're a nonprofit and there is no ownership, there's no equity to give. And so fundraising to start the company had to be a little bit more creative. And it's not always easy to write grants and get grant funding before you're actually operating and have the metrics to show how effective you are. And so I actually got the initial funding for FABSCRAP by pitching it on a television show, like a millennial. And so I was on Project Runway Fashion Startup. There were 4 investors. 3 of them ended up contributing, but also encouraged me to go nonprofit, and their investments became donations to get started. Wow. And that really helped just in giving me sort of the capital I needed to. I could move into a warehouse. I could start to rent cars to do the pickups. For the first year, I was renting a U-Haul once a week and driving through the garment district in New York City and picking up the fabric waste from brands. But the problem was so apparent, I think, to people who worked in the industry. In that first year, we had 100 brands sign up for service. So it grew really quickly.
So you're a nonprofit. Does that mean you can't make any money?
Anytime that we are profitable, it just means that instead of that being paid to owners, it stays in the company so you can continue and grow the mission. And what was really important to me also in being a nonprofit is that I didn't want this necessarily to be publicly funded and come all from public donations, because this isn't a public problem. This is really a business problem. This is an industry problem. And so I wanted the companies, all of these fashion companies, to pay for the solution and pay and invest into the infrastructure that's solving the problem. And so brands who recycle with us pay a service fee. And I think that's a really important component of how we're set up, because we are about 80 to 85% revenue generating, which is really atypical for most nonprofits. But the companies who recycle with us pay a service fee to recycle their textiles the same way that they would pay for paper recycling or metal, glass, and plastic recycling. We're just the textile version of that, but it does then hit their bottom line. It's something they have to be accountable for. It's something they have to budget for. It's something that hopefully incentivizes them to create less textile waste. So charging brands for the recycling service was a really important component. Where we don't charge them is for rolls of fabric. Those we take for free, because like any other thrift store, we're hoping to be able to resell them and redistribute them to people who can use them. And so that's the other important part of being a nonprofit, is that rolls of material that would otherwise go to landfill can come to us as a donation from that company. We can give them a tax receipt, and then we're able to sell them at discount to people who are crafting as customers, costume makers, fashion students who need it for projects, quilters, home sewers, people who are just in their Etsy phase of their fashion business. Between the fabric sales and the service fees, that's where we're most self-sustained. And then we do fundraise. It's really great when people like what we do and send donations. We have a silent auction every year to fundraise from our community. But really, we want the industry accountability.
That's fantastic. How can our listeners get involved and help you continue this mission?
Oh, I would love that. We need all the hands and help we can get. So our warehouse is in the Brooklyn Army Terminal in Sunset Park, and our warehouse is open to the public. That's actually where our reuse room is, so our fabric thrift store, but that's also where we're sorting all of the incoming material. And for people who don't work in fashion offices, what we're receiving are rolls of fabric, but also a lot of fabric swatches. So the fabric mill is making all of these different fabrics, and they send these swatches to brands. Sometimes it's unsolicited, just here's all my new fabric for the season. But that means brands usually will pick one or two and then toss the rest, and that's coming to us. And it's usually a piece of fabric that is staple taped or glued to a piece of paper or cardboard with all of the mill information should the brand want to order. But for us to recycle that fabric and recycle the paper, we have to deconstruct those swatch cards and headers. And so that's where we've been using volunteer help. Like 70 to 75% of what we receive are those swatches. It's definitely the most wasteful part of the design process, I think. And so volunteers are helping us pull off the paper so it can be recycled, sort through the fabric so it can be recycled. And volunteering is a 3-hour shift, 9 to noon or 1 to 4. We're open most days of the week, including Saturday. And as a thank you, we let volunteers take home 5 pounds of fabric for free. Not just the swatches, like the yardage. And so we do get a lot of fashion students who come and help. It's a great way to learn about fabric if you're interested. For Halloween, you can come and volunteer and then pick all of your materials to make your Halloween costume. So volunteering is great. If you are looking for fabric, come and shop at FABSCRAP. It's safe from landfill. It's really high quality from the design office, and it's thrift store prices. We try to stay about 60% below retail. We're moving a lot of material, and so just coming to the warehouse to help sort it is a huge support for us.
And it feels like you're doing a lot to create a community space and bring in the community. How important is that to you at FABSCRAP?
I don't think I realized how important that would be when I started the company. So at the beginning, there was sort of like, okay, I'll work with brands to bring fabric in, and then I'll work with people who use fabric to redistribute it and recycle it. But there's this whole missing piece in the middle where we're working with volunteers to sort it. And there's a whole educational component by all of these people who are using the fabric. They want to share skills and they want to meet each other, and it's a real community of upcycling and creativity. And so that really has been one of the most beautiful things about FABSCRAP over the years. Is it wasn't even something that I understood would be a component of the work at the beginning. And now it's so crucial that we're merging with another company just to focus on all of the individuals who are doing things every day to stop buying fast fashion, take care of their clothes, make their clothing last longer, and really shift our use of textiles and clothing on an individual level.
My last question is, what's the best way for listeners to keep in touch with y'all?
Sure. You can find us online. Our website is fabscrap.org. There's a button on our website where you can subscribe to our newsletter. We promise not to spam. It's only like 1 or 2 a month. But that's where you can see all upcoming events. Next year, I'm really excited. We'll be hosting craft nights, maker show and tells. We'll be doing workshops around a skill, some industry panels, a book club, sip and sorts. It's like a happy hour volunteering. Cute. So we're going to put up our community calendar very soon so you can see the dates for all of next year. Instagram is a great place to follow us and see what fabric is coming in. That's fab_scrap. And my Instagram is SchreibJess.
Perfect. Jessica, thank you so much again for joining us and for the incredible work that you and your colleagues do. You can find more information on and resources for textile waste and FABSCRAP's work in the show notes.
That's it for this episode of Climate Check, Stories and Solutions. Thanks for listening. To subscribe, go to climatecheck.fm. Climate Check is a production of 350 Brooklyn in Brooklyn, New York. Stay up to date with our releases by following 350 Brooklyn on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Our production team is George Ostro, Eva Dean, and Eveline Mole. That's me. Our research and writing team is Mimi Bluestone, Audrey Stanton, and Megan Eisenberg. Eva Dean is the executive producer with co-leader Audrey Stanton. The music you heard in this episode is from Blue Dot Sessions. 350 Brooklyn is a local affiliate of 350.org, a worldwide grassroots climate organization. Join us in finding solutions to counter climate change.